Would you believe me if I told you that everything that we define as beautiful is actually controlled by a number? It's not even a full number, it's actually a fraction, a ratio, and everything from magazines to movies to photography to modern art and Renaissance art, even nature is governed by this number. Would you believe me if I told you that even your own perception of what is beautiful and aesthetically pleasing is subconsciously being controlled by this ratio? What's up guys, I'm Mike, the Weird Pigeon, and you clicked on this video so you already know what it's about. So if you didn't already know, there is a diagram that looks kind of like a tic-tac-toe board that pretty much all visual artists use to create their compositions for their artwork. Everyone from photographers, videographers, sculptors, painters, pretty much literally anyone who deals in visual art uses this diagram, this tic-tac-toe looking diagram. And this diagram is actually called the rule of thirds, or the 9-grid zone. It has a few different names, but for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna call it the rule of thirds because that's what most people call it. Now, before I go too far into the rule of thirds and explain how to use the diagram, I'm actually gonna talk about what the rule of thirds is based off of, what this diagram is based off of, because really it is a simplified version of another diagram called the golden ratio. Now, the golden ratio looks a little complex, but is actually the graphed out version of a number. The number is the golden ratio. Now, this number, this ratio, which is 1.618033988875, you don't need to know that, I just thought it was interesting. But this number is actually ancient. Way back, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Just kidding, it was a while ago, but it was actually in ancient Greece. A bunch of really smart mathematician philosopher dudes basically figured out that there is a number or a ratio that governs all of the beauty in nature. Pretty much everything that naturally occurs in nature is governed by this ratio. Things like, our hands to our forearm are governed by this ratio. The structure of our face, the dimensions of our face is governed by this ratio. It's pretty insane how much this ratio shows up in nature. And the ancient Greeks became pretty much obsessed with this number. They pretty much figured out that to the human eye and to the human brain, seeing this ratio, this proportion, basically makes everything beautiful, makes everything aesthetically pleasing. They put this ratio in their art, they put this ratio in their architecture. Pretty much everything they made that was visual used this ratio as a guideline. And again, when this ratio is graphed out, you get the golden ratio diagram, which is that swirly looking thing. And if you actually take that diagram and you put it on a lot of Greek art and a lot of Greek architecture, you can begin to see how they use this diagram to pretty much create everything they made. It's almost astounding how much this ratio, this diagram shows up. And this ratio also isn't just in Greek art. It's even in ancient Roman art, because the Romans stole a lot of things from the Greeks. They stole this concept of using this ratio, this number, from the Greeks. And even, after the Middle Ages, when we had the rebirth of art and knowledge in the Renaissance, a lot of the Renaissance artists actually looked to ancient Greek and Roman artists for inspiration and knowledge on how to create like they did. So we actually see a lot of this golden ratio start to crop up during this time period as well. Things like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you can definitely see the existence of the rule of thirds and even some other Renaissance artwork. But really, the golden ratio graph and the rule of thirds are pretty much the same thing. One's just a lot less complicated than the other. It is kind of wild just how much artwork that we've seen uses this rule of composition. And even moving into like photography and movies, we see this rule for composition continue. And once you start to realize how to use this rule of thirds and this diagram for composition, you'll see it everywhere in everything. It's almost unavoidable. So I've talked a lot about the diagram, I've talked about the history, the fact that it's in pretty much everything that we see today and yesterday and the day before in ancient times. It's existed for a very long time. But how exactly do you use the rule of thirds? Well, basically what you do is in your compositions, you put your subject, or the most important part of your subject, sometimes the eye if it's like a close-up or anything like that, on the third. And what is the third? The third is basically where the lines of the tic-tac-toe board intersect. It's where they cross. you put your subject on one of those lines, whether it's the top right third or the bottom right third or the top left third or the bottom left third. Whichever one you put it on, our eyes will be naturally drawn to, and it just looks more aesthetically pleasing. Now, what if you don't have like a well-defined subject in your shot? What if you have maybe just an open landscape? Well, what you do then is you would actually take the horizon line and put that on one of the lines that go across the diagram horizontally. You basically want to line up things in your shot with the lines and the intersecting points of the diagram. That's pretty much how you use it. But what about this shot? This shot, I'm centered in the frame. I'm not exactly using the rule of thirds 100%. Well, you can get away with that. It is just as aesthetically pleasing to basically create symmetry in your shot by putting your subject directly in the middle as it is using the diagram and maybe framing your subject on the third. It really depends on what kind of shot you want to compose and how you want to use it. Now, of course, with everything, especially with art, there are rule breakers. Not everything has to use the rule of thirds, but for the most part, everything pretty much does. And really, you can actually use the rule of thirds to create an even better symmetrical, center subject shot by putting the eyes of the subject on one of the horizontal lines, preferably the top horizontal lines, of course. It'd look weird if your subject was down here and just like all forehead. Now, the rule of thirds isn't the only thing you want to kind of think of when composing a shot. There are other things like balance of your image, having an equal amount of things on one side as you do the other. So let's say if you have a subject and you put them on either the right or the left third, and then on the other side of your shot, it's just all empty space, that can look kind of awkward and unbalanced. You normally want to try to balance objects in your shot. So maybe having a more interesting background with maybe a few, points of interest in the background, and they don't have to be overbearing. You don't want them to be more interesting than your subject, of course. And a lot of times these objects will be out of focus anyway. But just having a balance of things in your shot just creates a more aesthetically pleasing image. And again, this isn't all just for photography or video. This sort of concept can be applied to anything from sculpting to painting, any kind of visual artwork. Another really important thing in a shot is leading lines or vector lines. This is something a lot of people in sketching or in painting and things like that understand really well. But having these sort of lines that kind of, in a way, point to your subject or direct your eye towards your subject is really great at not only guiding the people in your shot, but emphasizing certain parts of your shot. And this is a really good way of not only guiding people's eyes to whatever the focal point or the focus is in your shot, but it also creates a more aesthetically pleasing image. For instance, with this shot in particular, what I've got going on is I've got the frames up here create kind of like a line that kind of goes to my face. I've got the frames on this side kind of create a line that goes to my face. And then I've got my setup back here, the bookshelf. I don't know why I just forgot what that was called for a second. But I've got the bookshelf, has another line that kind of points to me. Everything in the image points you to my face, which is, it doesn't sound vain or anything, but I'm the most important part of the shot, so deal with it. But this is something you see all the time in cinematography and photography and even a lot of paintings, is these vector lines, these leading lines that kind of guide your eye through the shot and just create a more aesthetically pleasing shot. Also, this sort of thing creates depth, and depth is another important part of any kind of composition. There's nothing more boring than seeing somebody talk against just a flat wall. If you can have lots of depth in your background, that creates a more interesting shot and allows you to include things like these lines that kind of guide your eye towards the subject. As a matter of fact, I have the camera in the corner of my room and I'm shooting towards the other corner of my room. This naturally, shooting into a corner creates a lot of depth. And this can be applied to so many different things. If you want to make maybe your Zoom meeting look more aesthetically pleasing, instead of just framing yourself with the background, you're just up against a white wall, maybe try to frame yourself into the corner of a room where you get these leading lines naturally. Adding that little bit of flair to something as simple as, your composition in your Zoom meeting could make people more interested in what you have to say in those meetings because you're creating a more interesting shot. All right, guys, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, this was just a basics of composition and kind of like the history behind it. So if you're new to this channel and enjoyed this video, I'm actually going to be making a brand new video series where I'm going to be analyzing the Star Wars movies. I'm pretty much going to be analyzing the cinematography of the movies and kind of talking about my top 10 favorite shots, what I like about them, and using what I talked about in this video to analyze those shots and what makes them so iconic and well loved with not only me, but a lot of other Star Wars fans out there. If you can't already tell, I am also a huge Star Wars nerd with just all the stuff around me. So if you're new to this channel and you're into Star Wars photography, videography, that's pretty much what I talk about. I do equipment reviews, tutorials, and I break down, you know, the movies and analyze them and stuff like that. So guys, if you don't mind, consider subscribing and leaving a like and commenting and all the other things that the YouTubers tell you to do that you've probably heard like a million times by now. It's probably a little annoying. Sorry about that. But anyway, that's it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one, and bye.